pleasure to address you, students of a very prestigious law school in India. And so we have to understand that this is a law that applies exclusively in situations of armed conflict, not otherwise. Then the two key objectives of this law are also part of this definition. First of all, this law restricts the rights of parties from using means and methods of warfare of their choice. What I want to say in this context is that, in other words, it means that the parties to an armed conflict are not at full liberty to do whatever they want to do in times of armed conflict, even though they are engaged in a war. In other words, the law brings in some restrictions on the way wars are to be conducted. And this is what we mean by restricting means and methods of warfare, such as, just to give you some examples, when in the course of hostilities, an enemy combatant surrenders, drops his weapons and raises hands and surrenders, then the opposing combatant is not supposed to use force against such a person. You can arrest the person, you can take into custody, you can detain the person as a prisoner of war. But shooting a surrendered person is not permissible under the laws of war or international humanitarian law. This is just a very basic example of method of warfare. By means of warfare, essentially what we mean is certain types of weapons. And this law has restricted the use, and in some instances totally outlawed the use of certain types of weapons. We will eventually see what types of weapons are restricted or prohibited. Just some key examples are chemical weapons, biological weapons, anti-personnel landmines, cluster munitions, and so on. So this first objective of humanitarian law is regarding means and methods of warfare which are restricted purely on humanitarian grounds because they may cause excessive suffering, they may be indiscriminate in character, and so on. So these are some of the principles on the basis of which weapons are subject to restrictions, and also the methods of warfare are subject to restriction. The second one, objective, of humanitarian law is that it is intended to protect persons and property which is affected by or likely to be affected by situations of armed conflict. Now, it's very common knowledge to understand that wars, armed conflicts invariably bring suffering. Suffering to various categories of persons. You can imagine basically civilians. Civilians suffer a lot in the course of armed conflict. They can be sometimes mistakenly targeted. They may be harmed as a part of collateral damage, or they may get displaced. They may become refugees after leaving the boundaries of their country, and so on. So hardship is experienced by civilians to a great extent, not only to their person, but to their property also. Their houses may get destroyed in the course of bombardment and so on. Another example is wounded persons in times of armed conflict, both civilians as well as combatants. They also need humanitarian protection. That is another major category of persons that are liable or likely to be affected, and in most situations, in fact, affected by situations of armed conflict. Another major category of persons who are affected by armed conflict are people who are detained in relation to their participation in armed conflict. Enemy combatants who surrender, as I said just now, the other party can detain them as long as the conflict is going on. And therefore, detention happens to a great extent in armed conflict situations, as eventually we will see there are two major types of armed conflicts, international and non-international. And in both the types of armed conflicts, detention is very common. So these people who happen to fall into the hands of the adversary, in fact, is their enemy, there is every likelihood that these people might be mistreated or they may be tortured to extract information. They may be summarily executed. So there are many humanitarian challenges that will be faced and that are indeed faced in reality by people who are subjected to detention in times of armed conflict. Now, after having seen what is the definition of IHL, um, of course, a brief word regarding sources, and Chinmaya has already mentioned, we talk about international. I mean, when we think of public international law in general, I mean, the same sources are valid for IHL. Like international conventions, custom, general principles of law accepted by civilized nations, judicial decisions and juristic works as subsidiary means. And these are, I mean, the authoritative statement regarding sources of modern international law is nothing but Article 38 of the Statute of International Court of Justice, which outlines these as the key sources of in public international law. And these are again the same sources that are relevant for the growth and development of international humanitarian law. Earlier, I mentioned about applicability of international humanitarian law. And I said they are applicable. I mean, this law is applicable to two types of armed conflicts: international armed conflicts, which are wars or armed conflicts between two or more states. Now, before I proceed to non-international armed conflict, let me tell you very briefly about why do we use the words wars or armed conflicts. Are they the same or there is some difference? Now, um, if I was physically addressing you, I would have asked some of you questions, but now I have some limitations. I don't want to spend more time on asking you questions. I'll, of course, respond the other way around. If you ask me questions, I will definitely respond. Okay. So, war is a legal concept in international law which required certain criteria that when states are engaged in hostilities, and if there are hostilities happening in a systematic way and there is a declaration of war, then this legal status of war is set up, and under general international law, certain consequences of the existence of a situation of war follow. For example, suspension of diplomatic relations, suspension of trade and commerce, and then the return of each other's nationals, and so on. So in the practice of states, during 40s, 50s, and 60s, it emerged that on many occasions, states wanted to fight in a warlike manner. In fact, they wanted to engage in hostilities without making a declaration of war. And this type of practice created a kind of anomaly in the sense it was not very clear initially whether this is a war or not, because there is no legal declaration of war. And as a consequence of this, whether we apply the laws of war or not, because if the laws of war are not applied, the humanitarian protection is no more there. And therefore, in view of experts, the concept of armed conflict emerged, where the armed conflict, it doesn't require any kind of declaration. So the moment states engage in hostilities with each other, then the situation can be termed as a situation of armed conflict, irrespective of declaration, and then the law would start applying, and hence the title of law of war, which was used, which was very common at one point of time, was changed to law of armed conflict. And then later on, it was changed to international humanitarian law because of the overriding influence of the principle of humanity on subsequent growth of this law. So many states, they prefer to describe the law as international humanitarian law rather than law of armed conflict, and earlier the law of war. So today, if you come across these three terms, law of war, law of armed conflict, IHL, you must note that these are the same things. These are not different things, okay? So this is a brief word regarding the distinction and why the different terms, wars and armed conflicts. Now we move on to the next major category of armed conflict. It is non-international armed conflicts, which are essentially armed conflicts between states and non-state armed groups. If you look at today's scenario around the world, you will find majority of conflicts that are happening today are essentially non-international armed conflicts. Today, international armed conflicts have become rare because of many restrictions that have been imposed by UN Charter on use of force by a state against another. But we will come back to this when we look into relationship between IHL and law relating to use of force. So what we have to understand is today non-international conflicts are more in number, and they are essentially conflicts between states and non-state armed groups. However, we also have to understand that even in a non-international armed conflict, third states invariably get involved, and that may change the character of the armed conflict from non-international to international. Of course, this is a topic for separate presentation, especially for those who are going for advanced studies in humanitarian law. But for your purpose, what I would like to highlight is that a third state involvement in a non-international armed conflict could be either in the form of support to the state authorities or support to non-state armed groups. So the third state, depending on the political relationship between the state experiencing the non-international armed conflict, other states may decide to intervene and support a party. Take the case of Afghanistan at one point of time, not today, but earlier when there was a conflict, when in fact the conflict started sometime in 2001. If I give you Afghanistan example, it's a very interesting example. Following the World Trade Center attack, 9/11 attacks in the US and some allies, they launched a military campaign against Afghanistan, which was at that time being ruled by Taliban, because the US and allies, they contended that Taliban was behind supporting Al-Qaeda, which is responsible for 9/11 attacks. So it is essential that Taliban is replaced and removed from power and replaced by a democratic polity in Afghanistan. So military force was used against Taliban, and there was opposition to Taliban, which was in existence, but it was in the form of a non-state armed group. It was not in power. So at that time, essentially what type of conflict it was. I mean, it was an international armed conflict between United States allies on one hand and Afghanistan, which was under the rule of Taliban regime. In sometime in June 2002, Taliban was removed from power and the other group was they eventually took over. There is a traditional council of leaders in Afghanistan called as Loya Jirga, and that Loya Jirga was suspended during Taliban regime, but it was reconstituted and it became the de facto authority for Afghanistan in June 2002. So from that moment onwards, also US and allies, they stayed in Afghanistan, and Taliban became a non-state armed group at that time, continued to engage in hostilities with the new regime which took power after replacing Taliban with support from the Western countries. So now there was no more international armed conflict. The armed conflict was between the new government of Afghanistan and Taliban, and the new government was supported by US. So when a third country supports the state, the conflict remains non-international. It doesn't become international because international conflict requires two states minimum which are engaged in hostilities with each other. It was the case when Taliban was ruling Afghanistan prior to June 2002, when US started using military force in October 2001. So for that much period, it was international armed conflict. Later, it became a non-international armed conflict. Now, these situations, they highlight the point that character of a conflict might shift from international to non-international and from non-international to international as well. So this is extremely important in today's scenario because today, if you look around, probably each and every non-international conflict, there is some or other form of involvement of third states, whether it is on behalf of states or on behalf of armed groups, whether it is direct or whether it is indirect, but invariably it happens. It's a reality of modern times that a conflict doesn't remain purely non-international and confined within the territorial bounds of a particular state. Now, it is equally important to note that IHL is not applicable to situations of internal disturbances, tensions, violence, or riots, because these situations are governed by other regimes of law, such as human rights, national security law of the country. So humanitarian law is not applicable to these situations. You have to understand that humanitarian law regime is an exceptional regime. It gives authority to the parties to use military force against the adversary with impunity if the adversary is described as enemy combatant, if the adversary is engaged in hostilities. So that is an exceptional situation. That is where military necessity permits a state authority to use military force, which is not justifiable in times of internal disturbances, tensions, or riots, and so on. Imagine a country where there are some demonstrations against the state, but the situation has not reached the level of an armed conflict. But if that situation is brought under IHL, it would allow the state authorities to use military force against the demonstrators, and then the consequences would be quite disastrous. That is not permitted, and it is essential that applicability of IHL is confined exclusively to situations of armed conflict, and it is not extended to situations that strictly do not amount to armed conflict. Now, let me highlight something that briefly I have mentioned earlier. You see, humanitarian law has to be realistic. Unless it is realistic, it will not be acceptable to states. Now, imagine a state which is attacked by another state. The natural reaction of such a state would be to react with use of military force by way of self-defense, of course, because it is the responsibility of a state to protect its nationals from external attack, external aggression. Also, to preserve its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and political independence. And to that end, the state may be required to use military force against the adversary who has started a war of aggression. And humanitarian law recognizes this prerogative or this right of a state to use military force against an adversary, against the military targets of an adversary on the basis of the principle of military necessity. So, in other words, we can say that use of armed force to attain legitimate military objectives is lawful. It is permitted under IHL. So this is what we understand by the principle of military necessity, which happens to be one of the fundamental principles of IHL, as we will see eventually. Now, having said this, that military targets can be attacked or use force can be used against legitimate military objectives, we need to also think of the principle of humanity. Because when on one hand we contend, and when IHL contends that, all right, if you are required to use military force against an adversary who has started a conflict, you are allowed, you are not restricted, you are permitted to do that, but subject to certain conditions. And the conditions are that you are not supposed to target civilians, or you are not supposed to use force or inflict suffering, injury, or destruction which is not necessary to accomplish a legitimate military purpose. In other words, civilian objects, individual civilians, civilian infrastructure must be spared. It must not be subject to attack by virtue of the principle of humanity. Whereas military necessity allows you to use force against military targets, the principle of humanity doesn't allow you to use force against civilian targets. This is very straightforward and simple. So in all IHL rules, you will find a balance needs to be struck between these two opposing principles. They are essentially opposing. Military necessity says use force, allowed. Humanity says be careful. Certain targets, no use of force. Now it is easy to say these as basic principles, fundamental principles explain, but in reality, a military commander may be confronted with very complex situations. And these situations must be taken into account by IHL if IHL has to be realistic and acceptable to states. And here we come across, I'm sorry, I have to go back. We come across what we mean by the principle of proportionality. Because when we say that the balance is to be struck between these two opposing principles, it is struck by the principle of proportionality. But let me give you an example. What do we mean by principle of proportionality in this particular context. Because in some contexts, the word proportionality, even in international law, is used in a different sense. In the law relating to self-defense, we always say that measures which are taken by way of self-defense have to be proportionate in relation to the threat posed by an attack. Okay, that is one meaning of proportionality under international law, but that is not the same meaning in international humanitarian law. Let me explain what it is. Principle of proportionality in humanitarian law means that if a state has directed, a party to a conflict has directed an attack on a military target, and in the course of such an attack, a few civilians get killed, because that could not be avoided, because the target was located at such an place, or there were civilians passing close by to that area, but that could not be avoided because destruction of the military target was an imperative military necessity for example, for weakening the enemy's forces. Then the attack had to be carried out, but in the course of such an attack, some civilians get killed or some civilian objects get destroyed. Now, as I said, humanitarian law has to be practical and realistic. And in keeping with this viewpoint, what humanitarian law provides for is that if civilian loss is proportionately low in relation to the military advantage that is gained, then in that case, it may be excused. Of course, what is the essential requirement here is that the loss has to be proportionately low in relation to military advantage. And this cannot be quantified, that if there are 10 military men killed, whether you can kill 5 civilians or 2 civilians. No, you cannot quantify like that, because it depends on the military value of a particular target. And in relation to that military value of a target, whether in a given situation, the civilian loss that has taken place is proportionate or disproportionate needs to be examined in relation to the circumstances which ruled at that time and all the relevant facts. So whenever attacks or use of force is directed at military targets and some civilians or civilian objects get destroyed, then such a loss can be described as incidental loss of civilians if it is proportionately low. It's in common parlance also known as collateral damage, which term I'm sure you have come across. So these are three key principles, but we also have some other principles, some we have already seen. So let us have a quick look at other principles, and I hope you have understood the relationship between these three principles: military necessity on one hand, humanity on the other hand, and the balance that is struck between these two, which is achieved by the principle of proportionality. So the first two we have already seen, the three in fact, proportionality. The fourth one is principle of distinction. And this is again related to other principles that we have seen, some of the fundamental norms of IHL. When we say that attacks can be directed only against military targets and civilians should be spared, it is necessary to distinguish between civilian objects and military objects, or individual civilians and combatants. And that is what we understand by principle of distinction, which requires that military commanders must distinguish between legitimate military targets and civilian objects, including the civilian population. Unless the military commanders do this, they cannot follow the previous principles that directing attack only against military targets. So the principles are interlinked. So the principle of distinction is one of the vital principles for humanitarian law, because ultimately the objective of humanitarian law is to afford protection to people who are not participating in hostilities, like civilians. And that objective will be defeated if the distinction between the two categories, the broad categories, is not maintained. And therefore, we always say that these are some of the vital principles for humanitarian law. And finally, principle of limitation, which I have briefly indicated earlier, that when states or parties are engaged in a conflict, they do not have unlimited right as to what they can do and what they cannot do. In other words, the rights of the belligerents, that is parties to a conflict, to choose methods and means of warfare is not unlimited. In other words, it is restricted, and it is restricted by humanitarian law, again, to afford better protection to people who are not participating. So weapons which are indiscriminate in character, like chemical weapons or poisonous weapons, bacteriological weapons, even anti-personnel landmines, these are restricted. Some of them are outright prohibited. So limitations are included in various norms of humanitarian law right from older times. On the basis of this principle, that your right in times of armed conflict to do whatever you want to do is not unrestricted. It is subject to certain limitations, and these limitations, they come in the form of legal norms. They are binding, and they must always be respected, so that humanitarian law achieves its overall objective of alleviating suffering of people who are affected or likely to be affected by situations of armed conflict. And on the basis of these principles, a number of fundamental rules are derived, which are very easy to understand. I need not go into the detail, like ensuring human treatment to persons not taking part, not to kill or injure protected persons like medical personnel, humanitarian workers, civilians, and so on. Then collecting and caring of the wounded and sick is another important aspect of IHL, and respecting lives and dignity of captured combatants and civilians is also essential. I mentioned earlier about combatants who can be captured, but civilians can be subject to some restrictions on their liberty in the interest of their safety. And this is what we call in humanitarian law as internment. They are not detained for commission of any offense or crime or some wrong, or because they are participating in hostilities, or merely because they belong to the enemy. But their movement may be restricted in the interest of their own safety and security. So that is what is permitted by IHL. They can be put in a particular camp called as internment camp, and they have to be treated with respect, and their needs have to be taken care of by the parties who go for internment. Then judicial guarantees during trials and proceedings of detained persons must be respected. Now, those who are detained in relation to armed conflict, why we have to prosecute them? Now, there are 2 or 3 types of situations we have to understand. Prisoners of war, for example, who have committed serious violations of IHL, or in other words, if they have committed war crimes, they can be prosecuted and punished. Another important aspect is in non-international armed conflict. And this is very important because in a non-international armed conflict, there is no prisoner of war status. Prisoner of war status means lot of protection under IHL that doesn't extend to non-international armed conflict. The reason is that those who are engaged in a conflict with the state itself, in other words, members belonging to non-state armed groups, they are essentially violating law of the land, because using force against the state is a very serious crime in all the legal systems of the world. Waging war against the state and so on. You see, in Indian Penal Code and so on, you come across these things. So imagine a state where there is a non-international conflict, there is a non-state armed group, people belonging to this group are engaged in in use of military force against the state authorities. They are, in the eyes of the state, essentially criminals, because they have committed a very serious crime. And if they are detained by the state, if they fall into the hands of the state, then they can very well be prosecuted for having participated in situation of a non-international armed conflict, even though they have not committed any violation of IHL, even though they are not war criminals as such, but they can be looked upon as criminals under law of the land, under the criminal law of the country, and therefore they can be subject to prosecution. This is permitted under IHL. IHL doesn't interfere in the sovereign right of a state to deal with those who have committed a crime under their legal system. Because again, as I said, that IHL has to be practical, acceptable to states. And if you take away this right of a state to prosecute members of an armed group who are often described as rebels in the common parlance, but not under IHL. IHL doesn't use the term rebels. IHL would use the terms members belonging to a non-state armed group. There is no precise term, but they are in a way combatants in a non-international armed conflict. So this is regarding judicial guarantees, which must be respected during trials and proceedings, whether these are the trials in relation to war crimes or for national law crimes in a non-international armed conflict. We have also seen about the choice of means and methods of warfare, which are which can be subject to restrictions by virtue of the principle of limitation and the principle of distinction. So these are the fundamental rules of IHL. Now, 4 Geneva Conventions, which are the most basic instruments of IHL. The first one dealing with land warfare, second one with maritime warfare, third one with prisoners of war, and fourth one on protection of civilians. So these are the key instruments of IHL adopted in 1949. Of course, the very first Geneva Convention was adopted in 1863. And since then, they have been revised from time to time. But I don't want to go into the historical overview, which again happens to be another interesting area, but it requires a lot of time. You can sometime have a look at how humanitarian law has grown historically over the years, centuries even. So today, these are the binding instruments, which are again complemented by 2 additional protocols adopted in 1977. After the diplomatic conference of 1974 to 77. Now, let me give you a brief word regarding why the protocols were adopted. Why was it necessary? First of all, we have to understand that since 1949, many technological changes had taken place and many other changes in the way wars were fought and conflicts, non-international conflicts were taking place, and it was necessary to update the law in view of new changes. And this process of revising rules of law is very common. I mean, as law students, I am sure you appreciate why we need to see that the law is dynamic and it is not static. Static law is not a good law because it cannot take into account contemporary needs and challenges. And therefore, amending A law which is made long time back is essential. In international law, we say new conventions need to be adopted to complement the previous law or modify the law and so on. So that was one reason why these conventions were, the protocols were adopted. Another important reason is that, and this applies not only to humanitarian law, but to other branches of international law in general, like law of the sea, law relating to diplomatic relations, and so on, is that in 1950s and 60s, a large number of states which were parts of colonial empires gained their independence as a part of the process of decolonization. So from the colonial powers, they gained their independence, and we collectively called them as third world countries and so on by different terminologies. By applying economic criteria, developing countries, and so on. That apart, let me simply say that newly independent countries and the colonial empires in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the Pacific, you see in most places, the process of what we call as international lawyers call as self-determination was happening, and in connection with decolonization, of course, it was a very special process because some countries, including India, had to engage in a long struggle to regain the sovereignty of the nation from the British rule for us. Likewise, it happened in other parts of the world, the Spanish, the French, and the other empires, including British empires in other parts of the world, like in Africa and so on. So the bottom line is a large number of states became independent. Now in international law, we say that all states are bound by international law. Even new states, when they become members, full-fledged members of international community, they are supposed to follow the rules of international law. Now, the newly independent countries were a bit concerned about the whole idea, and they said that the law, international law, which we are expected to follow, was made by whom? Predominantly by European powers. And that law was made with a view to take into account their interests. And we, the newly independent countries' aspirations, needs, challenges that we face are not taken into account by the pre-existing international law. So they were not happy to follow the international law as it was given to them when they became independent, and they were told that you have to follow this. They said, no, we don't like many areas, and some of our problems, issues, challenges are not taken into account. So what is necessary is revision of that law, revision of public international law in specific sectors. And then you see law of the sea, another example. The diplomatic conference to draft the third United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, UNCLOS 3 as it is known widely, took place. And in 1982, a new Law of the Sea Convention was adopted after almost 10 years of negotiations, which were quite contentious. And again, you see the law of treaties, the diplomatic conference to adopt law on diplomatic relations, then world trade, and so on. So this happened in many sectors. Likewise, it also happened in humanitarian law. And this was in the form of the Diplomatic Conference of 1974 to 77, which gave for the first time an opportunity to third world countries or the newly independent countries to express their needs, concerns, and express their voice in reshaping international humanitarian law. So there are many areas within humanitarian law which were not addressed earlier, such as guerrilla warfare, the problem of mercenarism, then also to some extent the combatant status in non-international armed conflict, or new protocol on purely on non-international armed conflict, and so on. So remember the importance of this process, and especially why the protocols were adopted in 1977. Now, I told you earlier about prohibited or restricted weapons. So we have a number of treaties and conventions. I am not going into them, but you can have a look at some of these whenever you have time. So starting from 1868, the process goes on and on from time to time. As you can see the timeline, the subject matter, the scientific advancements and developments which necessitated adoption of new protocols. Look at the 1995 blinding laser protocol. It was because of development of a new type of weapon. This protocol was adopted, that when it was realized that laser technology can be used for blinding in times of war, and some countries had embarked on a serious research on developing laser weapons for blinding enemy. The international community got alarmed and said, no, we cannot allow such inhuman weapons to be developed. So we need a protocol. It was adopted. So the bottom line is the process keeps happening. And the latest one is on nuclear weapons. I mean, the treaty has been adopted, but the real challenge is that nuclear powers have not acceded, or they have not ratified this treaty as yet. But it is expected that as and when the situation changes, political situation and so on, then the states who are today's nuclear powers, they may also feel compelled to become a party to Nuclear Weapons Convention. Now I come to the second part, and very quickly, we have already seen that it's a branch of, IHL is a branch of public international law. Its sources are common, its subjects are states essentially, but just to highlight, individuals, today we say individuals are also subjects of IHL, and they were added purely because of IHL. And this happened after Second World War, when there were two special tribunals which were set up to deal with Nazi war criminals. There was a Nuremberg trial and there was a Tokyo trial. I'm sure all of you know about that Tokyo trial for the Japanese war criminals. And it was essentially the first time individuals were prosecuted for serious violations of international law. And gradually, individuals came to be accepted as subjects of international law in general. And then the general principles regarding jurisdiction, state responsibility, dispute settlement, etc., they do apply to IHL as well. So when we say that international humanitarian law is a part of public international law, it has it is its sources, subjects, and general principles, they're bound to be common. But international humanitarian law has some close affinity to some specific areas within public international law. And one area is regarding law relating to use of force. Another is human rights. The third is international criminal law. And the fourth is refugee law. So let us quickly have a look at some of these and see how IHL is related to these. As students of public international law, I need not go into the details that there are in international law rules relating to use of force, what we call as jus ad bellum on one hand, and then there are rules governing conduct of hostilities, that is rules as to how the wars are to be waged, and these are essentially the rules of humanitarian law. Now, rules relating to use of force have been adopted with a view to maintain international peace and security. Look at the UN Charter, which outlaws use of force. Look at Article 2, Paragraph 4, which says that all states shall refrain from any use or threat of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of other states. This is one of the cardinal provisions in the UN Charter, because UN was created with a view to I'm sorry, I just pressed something. Yeah. The UN was created. One of the key objectives was maintenance of international peace and security on the background of Second World War, even the First World War. And what the leaders at that time said that if we want to avoid the Third World War, we need to restrict use of force, and Article 2, Paragraph 4 was included. Exception was admitted in the form of Article 51, right of inherent self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter. So this is the law relating to use of force. It is not part of IHL. It is a part of general international law. But again, it relates very closely to situations of wars and armed conflicts, where we have rules governing conduct of hostilities, which have been adopted on humanitarian considerations. And these rules would apply to any situation of a conflict, irrespective of legitimacy of the conflict, in the sense whether a given situation is a war of aggression or a war of self-defense is immaterial for IHL. IHL would apply at all times to all types of armed conflicts. I mean, at all, when I say at all times, is at all times in situations of armed conflicts, irrespective of the fact that why the fighting is going on. IHL is not concerned with the question why. It is concerned with the question how. How are you fighting? Are you sparing civilians or not? Are you confining your attacks to military targets or not? So this is the relationship between these two areas, international law of use of force and which of course is to be found in the UN Charter, and the rules regarding conduct of hostilities are to be found in IHL, the Geneva Conventions, and other instruments. Now, regarding human rights, you are all familiar with human rights law. I mean, human rights law, IHL have distinct historical origins. Their codification has taken place on different lines. You know about Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then the subsequent covenants, 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and so on. Their efficiency is based on different principles. In humanitarian law, we have seen military necessity, humanity, proportionality, and so on. But these are not the same principles in human rights, where you talk about the imperative need to protect human dignity everywhere under all circumstances. So though there are differences between these two regimes, they are both inspired by a common concern, and the common concern is the necessity to ensure respect for and protection of human dignity. See, as far as IHL is concerned, we talk predominantly of human dignity in times of armed conflicts, whereas human rights law talks about protection of human dignity at all times, not purely in situations of armed conflict, but at all times. But then you also have to note that certain human rights can be suspended in times of public emergencies, including situations of armed conflict. And this is what you find in in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I think it's Article 4, which gives a right of derogation to states parties from their obligations in times of public emergencies. And then human rights law may not be adequate to take care of all the needs of people affected by situations of armed conflict. You need humanitarian law, but then since they are concerned with a common objective, that is the necessity to ensure respect for and protection of human dignity, there are bound to be overlaps. There are bound to be certain common elements, and they do exist. So what we can say is today IHL is an essential complement to human rights law applicable in times of armed conflict. Circle of persons protected by IHL and human rights overlaps like civilians and so on. Links between these two are growing stronger because many rules in IHL, modern IHL, including additional protocols of 1977, they are inspired by human rights law. I would like to draw your attention in particular to Article 75 of Additional Protocol 1, which talks about fundamental guarantees of humane treatment to people who are subject to detention. If you carefully read and read between the lines, you will realize these are essentially human rights guarantees, which have been transposed into humanitarian law treaties. And humanitarian law treaties have also influenced developments in the field of human rights. Look at the protocol to Convention on the Rights of the Child dealing with age for recruitment of children for in armed conflict, or child soldiers, in other words. So this is essentially a kind of situation. Child soldiering is valid in times of armed conflict, but here you have a human rights instrument talking about protection of children in times of armed conflict. And number of principles are today common to IHL and human rights. Just to give you example, extrajudicial killing, prohibition on torture, persecution, inhuman treatment. These are common in IHL and also in human rights. So essentially what we can say is that though these are distinct bodies of law, they complement each other and they afford better protection if they are well respected in situations of armed conflict. Now coming quickly to refugee law, international protection of refugees is supported by a framework of law that defines who is a refugee, what are their rights and obligations, what are their duties. So this is the Refugee Convention of 1951, which gives a large degree of protection. Many provisions of this convention today can be said to have become part of customary international law, and therefore not only confined to the states parties, because India is not a state party to the 1951 convention, but India is following number of norms regarding protection of refugees because Indian government feels obliged to follow these norms because probably they have passed into customary international law. Now, UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, a body which was created under the 1951 Convention, it has a mandate to ensure international protection of refugees, work with governments to seek lasting solutions for their problems. And another important aspect of refugee law is that often you find people become refugees because of a situation of armed conflict. There are civilians who have left their country and have taken refuge in another country. They can be protected as refugees if they fulfill certain conditions. But a person doesn't become a refugee all the time because of war. A person can leave the country because of political persecution, because there is a threat to his or her life, because of the views being held by that person, and so on. There may not be a situation of armed conflict when a person leaves the country and becomes a refugee. But a large number of people are becoming refugees today because of situations of armed conflict. Take the case of Syria, or people who are migrating from Africa to Europe, and even Afghans who are leaving the country, who have already, after the Taliban takeover recently, I mean, you see the thousands of people who have left the country and who are aspiring to leave the country, but who cannot, unfortunately, because they suspect that their lives are in danger now in today's Afghanistan. So we have to understand that refugees are also protected by IHL as civilian victims of armed conflicts. But refugees, they need another protection for their resettlement and for their welfare and so on. So refugee law essentially looks at long-term protection, not only immediate protection in times of armed conflict, because humanitarian law is concerned more with emergency response. Now we have to give immediate protection to people who are wounded or people who are displaced, people who are leaving the country. So it is more concerned with emergency protection, but it doesn't look into their long-term needs. And therein, refugee law steps in. So again, you see the complementarity between the two. Now, if there are refugee settlements and if there are attacks in times of armed conflict, then it becomes a matter of concern for humanitarian law, because refugee settlements in a place where there is an armed conflict happening, they are essentially civilian objects protected by the principle of distinction. Now, often you are confronted with complex situations, and this arose in connection with Rwandan situation. You see, I'm sure you are, as students of international law and as aware citizens, you know at least the basics of what happened in Rwanda in 1994, when Hutus and Tutsis, there was a kind of genocide, and a large number of people were killed. Many left. But as the Tutsis were gaining power with the forces which had stationed in Uganda under the leadership of Paul Kagame, they entered into Rwanda to stop the genocide. And as the Hutus who were responsible for the massacres, they started leaving, and many of them went to Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, the neighboring state again. And there were refugee camps established there, and it was suspected that many refugee camps in genocide. So whether they become military objects or not, whether genociders were entitled to refugee status or not, these are some complex questions. And this question arises in connection with what we say as a refugee war criminal. A person may fulfill all the criteria for grant of refugee status, but a person has committed war crimes, and the war criminal may be that person has fulfilled other criteria of that the person is fleeing war and so on. There is threat to life, etc., etc. But then may be excluded from refugee status because of the background, because refugee status means lot of protection, and the person may not be entitled to that protection because of the background, and the person may be prosecuted and punished for having committed war crimes. And above all, states which are giving refuge, they may not like to have war criminals on their soil. So they may say, we don't want to give refugee status to people who have committed serious violations in the form of acts of genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. So refugee war criminals may be. Now, war criminality, war crimes is essentially violation of IHL, what are called as grave breaches of Geneva Conventions, which provide for universal jurisdiction, which also provide for national courts jurisdiction for prosecution and punishment. In India, we have the Geneva Conventions Act of 1960, which provides for a prosecution of those guilty of grave breaches of Geneva Conventions. But of late, we are also seeing international tribunals. We have past examples like international tribunals in the context of Second World War, Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals. Then of late, you have tribunal for former Yugoslavia, tribunal for Rwanda, tribunal for Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and more importantly, today the International Criminal Court. So these tribunals do have jurisdiction in respect of war crimes, which are essentially violations of international humanitarian law. And here, the principles of criminal law and judicial guarantees are applicable to war crime trials, and therefore this raises some interesting questions about relationship between international criminal law and IHL. I'm sure you, as students of public international law, you must have come across the Rome Statute on ICC, in particular Article 8 of the Rome Statute, which talks about war crimes, and it gives a long list of what are the war crimes that come within the jurisdiction of the court. So you can see the overlap between international humanitarian law and international criminal law. There are lots of complementarities between the two, and these have become extremely important today in the context of emergence of international tribunals which deal with war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. Of course, genocide and crimes against humanity can be committed even outside the context of an armed conflict. War crimes, they can be committed exclusively in situations of armed conflict, but it's not the other way around. Genocide can be committed in times of armed conflict, like it happened in Rwanda. Crimes against humanity can be committed in times of armed conflict. If the conduct doesn't amount to to a war crime, the conduct may amount to a crime against humanity. So I'm not going into the details, but the point I wanted to make is there is a strong and close relationship between international humanitarian law and IHL. So let me make a few concluding observations. I'll stop and I'll take a few questions. So IHL has a long historical background. Of course, as earlier Chinmaya said, that rules regarding laws regarding warfare have existed for a long time. But of course, we have seen, and it has grown over the years and keeps growing. The regime of IHL operates within the general framework of public international law. It is not a regime by itself, independent, but it has the same sources. It's a part of public international law, and it complements other legal regimes and at the same time derives strength from them, like the human rights law, refugee law, law relating to use of force, as well as international criminal.
So we have one question from Chinmaya. He asks, what is the scope of application of IHL to private military organizations?
Yes, now this issue has become quite critical of late because we have seen during last about, let me say 15, 20 years, there is large dependence on private military security companies in many parts of the world. And certain functions which were earlier discharged by the state armed forces are entrusted to private military security companies, such as interrogating prisoners and guarding military installations in conflict situations and so on. And often they are equipped with weapons. So the issue has come up in many situations as to what is their status. Are they part of regular combatants, or are they looked upon as just mercenaries? And what happens above all, and most critical question is, what happens if they have committed violations? Who is accountable? So currently there is a process which is going on to adopt certain best practices and to see whether a new protocol can be adopted to deal with private military companies. This process is called as Montreux process, and you will find on ICRC's website lot of discussion. There is Montreux document 1 and Montreux document 2 adopted already, which contains certain norms, and it goes into great lengths as to who is responsible to ensure proper behavior, whether and under what circumstances they become part of regular armed forces, and whether the commanding officer of a particular unit can be held accountable by virtue of the principle of superior responsibility. But then there are number of states involved, the state of registration of the company, the state of nationality of the people who are working for private military security companies, another state, because imagine a company registered in US and some people from Israel have joined joined that company to work for that company, and that company is invited, deployed by, say, another country in a fourth country where there is a conflict going on. Imagine a situation like Afghanistan, where a company like Blackwaters was deployed. American company had people coming from different countries working for it, located in a third host country. Afghanistan is a host country. So when you have number of states, you need to look at their respective obligations. And in a way, all the concerned states are responsible directly or indirectly to ensure that their behavior is in conformity with international humanitarian law. So I would encourage you to have a look at the norms and guidelines which have emerged. But the point I want to make is that this is a genuine issue. This is a challenge. This is a new challenge in the field of humanitarian law, and the international community is looking at it. It's on the agenda and it is under discussion, and the process is on already. So we have to wait and see how it goes. But in the meantime, whatever the best practices have emerged, whatever consensus has emerged, can be looked upon as a state practice, before a treaty is adopted or a protocol is adopted. So we therefore have to look at these processes as contributing or influencing state practice. Eventually, it may culminate into some customary norms and then become part of binding international law. That's what I would like to say about this.
Thank you, sir. Presuming that there are no more questions from the audience, I would like to move further. Once again, thank you so much, sir, for such an informative session on international humanitarian law. I would now like to invite Chinmaya to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you again, Gayatri. Cicero said, and I quote, "Gratitude is not the only greatest of virtues, but the parent of all others." Good afternoon, everyone. And it is indeed my privilege to be delivering the vote of thanks to all the people who are involved in making this webinar a success. I first of all would like to thank our guest speaker, Professor Umesh Kadam sir, for taking out time from his busy schedule and giving us such an insightful lecture on the place of international humanitarian law in the international legal system and enlightening us with his knowledge. Thank you so much, sir, for a knowledge enriching and informative session. It gave us deep insights into the topic and also revealed some interesting facts. I would also like to thank our respected Dean, Dr. T.R. Subramania, sir, without whom this program wouldn't have been possible. Thank you, sir, for always supporting students in all our endeavors and constantly organizing such sessions. I would further like to thank our beloved Vice Principal, Professor Vijay Praneshwaran, sir, and our faculty coordinator, Vidya Amen ma'am, for her endurance in arranging this webinar for the students. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all the heads of other CMR institutions who are present with us for joining us on this occasion. And I would also like to extend my thanks to all the faculties for their presence and support. Last but not the least, I'd also like to thank all the students for patiently listening to the session and also being present for the same. Thank you everyone for making this event a great success, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Chinmay.
Thank
sir.
you and good luck to all of you.